It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our three speakers for today, the visiting scholars in practice for the month of October. Our first visiting scholar in practice is Andrew Barclay. Andy and his wife, Michelle, in partnership with Emory Law School, founded and endowed the Barton Center to advocate for research-based policy and to encourage students from all disciplines into public interest career paths. Andy works as a full-time volunteer technical consultant, providing technical and statistical support to Georgia nonprofit and governmental agencies. He has worked in computing for over 25 years in both the for-profit and public sectors. He has experience in hardware and software engineering, high-performance computing, digital signal processing, database design, data analysis, statistics, and public health. Andy retired from for-profit work in information technology in the late 90s and now spends nearly all of his time as a volunteer. He also serves on advisory groups and steering committees for nonprofits and government agencies. And Andy served for 4 years as the Chief Justice's appointee to the board of the Georgia Technology Authority. He serves currently on Georgia's Governor's Office for Children and Families on the board of Georgia's Governor's Office for Children and Families at the appointment of Governor Perdue. Andy holds a master's degree in mechanical and electrical engineering from Stanford University and the Georgia Institute of Technology. He is also completing a PhD in biostatistics at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health. Our next speaker is Isabel Blanco. Isabel was a national consultant with the Annie E. Casey Foundation before coming to Georgia. She moved here permanently in 2007. She is currently the Executive Director of Family Outcomes and Practice Standards for the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, also known as Defect. In this capacity, she oversees over 6,000 staff in 159 counties and in the state office. Under her leadership, Georgia has successfully passed the Child and Family Services Review Performance Improvement Plan and made significant performance improvements recently recognized by the National Governors Association and the National Council of State Legislators. She has also implemented permanency roundtables across the state of Georgia. The permanency roundtables have resulted in permanent homes for over 1,000 children since 2010. This practice has now been adopted by over 20 other states and has been designated a bright idea by Harvard University's Innovations in Government. Previously, Isabel served as the Chief of Social Services for the Chicago Housing Authority, where she was responsible for overseeing the largest housing transformation in the nation, bringing down infamous housing projects like Cabrini Green. She also served as a regional administrator for the Illinois Department of Human Services, providing leadership to the largest region in the state. For 5 years, Isabel served as the vice president at the Jane Addams Whole House Association in Chicago. Here she led the conceptual framework, research, and development of new program models for child welfare. She developed 3 nationally recognized models and added $10 million to the Whole House operating budget in just 2 years. Isabel has served in various other positions, having started her career as an investigator in child welfare. She has a Bachelor's of Art in Psychology, Sociology, and Spanish from North Park College in Chicago and has completed graduate coursework toward a master's in Community and Family Counseling at Northeastern Illinois University. Our final speaker for today is Christopher Church. And Christopher is the managing attorney for the Supreme Court Committee on Justice for Children. He is a graduate of Gonzaga University Law School and holds a master's in mathematics from the University of North Texas. He completed his undergraduate studies at Concordia College in Bronxville, New York. He serves on the board of directors of the Georgia Association of Counsel for Children and is the chair of the self-evaluation team for Georgia Youth Opportunities Initiative. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Christopher taught undergraduate math at the University of North Texas and Spokane Falls Community College. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's going to feel a little weird holding this mic up here. The audio is not being projected into the room. It's for the recording purposes. So if we do have questions throughout the presentation, please let us know and I'll walk out and we'll share the mic for a little while. And if you can't hear us, please let us know and we'll try and project louder. Let me see if I can pull this slide up. What the three of us want to talk about today is the Child and Family Services Review as a way to evaluate Georgia's changing child welfare environment. By way of an agenda, we'll do a general kind of overview of what the Child and Family Services Review is and how it's impacted practices in the state of Georgia. After that, we'll take a brief break, and if we stay on track here, hopefully come back and talk about two specific parts of the Child and Family Services Review that we want to highlight, both some of the successes in Georgia and then some of the challenges moving forward. The three of us are going to share this presentation throughout the next 2 hours, and we're pretty good at this, and we'll chime in and interrupt each other when we feel like we've got something important to say. But we would like to encourage the audience as well to chime in and have a conversation with us. So we'll go ahead and start with just a brief history of the Child and Family Services Review. Congressional authorization in 1994 charged the Children's Bureau under the federal government to review state and child family service programs. The initial idea was really to monitor procedural compliance, to essentially look at how many timely investigations were completed, or how many, essentially procedural compliance. 2000 marked a pretty big shift in that system from a procedural system to really an outcome-driven system. And we looked more and we were concerned more, at least as the federal government standpoint, of how children and families are treated when they interact with our child welfare system.
It might be important to also have a parallel timeline. At this time, many of the states were putting up their own information tracking systems. In Georgia, it's called SHINES. It took a long time to put up. So many of the states were concerned, can our technology actually capture and be able to report, given the substantial incentives or penalties with the federal government? So there are two things happening at the same time.
The idea behind the Child and Family Services Review from the federal government standpoint was first to ensure compliance. Child welfare is largely federally funded, so that funding comes down through the Department of Health and Human Services, Children's Bureau, and they wanted to ensure conformity. Our states complying with those child welfare requirements. The second was just to get a better understanding of what's happening to children and families that come into contact with our state child welfare system. And then finally, to assist states to enhance their capacity to help these children and families. And this is one that we'll draw on quite a bit. There's some evidence here in Georgia, some of our practices, to where we think the Child and Family Service Review truly has enabled us to improve the process that these families experience. The overarching kind of three goals that the Children's Bureau sets forth is safety, permanency, and well-being. These are kind of the buzzwords in child welfare. We hear them echoed again and again, and this really came from the Adoption and Safe Families Act, some federal legislation that was pretty massive overhaul to focus on those three priorities.
Well, the CFSR and the legislation that ushered it in was a stroke of the pen. What it really did invite into certainly an agency like Defect is the necessity for leadership to create change in behavior. So how does legislation with an instrument for performance assist in change in behavior of caseworkers? When you think about how it came down, it's got to trickle down pretty far to the front line what it is this legislation and the CFSR intended to do. The CFSR has definition and measures, but it does not articulate values by which caseworkers can really differentiate between the importance of a number or the importance of the outcome. That had to be created by leadership, and it is a difficult thing because even if one leader at the top is able to articulate it, it must be trickled down all the way down to the bottom. The CFSR in no way addresses organizational development capacity that must be created in order to operate with those kinds of parameters.
And you all, I'm sure, are familiar with CAPTA and ASFA and the tension between safety and permanency. And for the first time, when the CFSR came along in 2000, we had some numbers to put against those things. We had some permanency numbers prior to that, but in Georgia, at least, and in most other states, we had no measurement on safety. So this brought us our first safety measures.
And I think it's also important to note that the CFSR is primarily tracking outcomes for the department responsible for outcomes for children, but it impacts every area of the child welfare community. The courts, the providers. It even touches law enforcement in terms of responsiveness and many other issues. But it does not address any penalties or documentation so much in other stakeholder areas. So a lot of responsibility for the executive branch, but it also has underlying implications for how the partners have to work together.
And just in generally, this is kind of the framework for those three priorities, those three goals with safety, permanency, and well-being. And we'll look at some definitions. The one I want to draw your attention to here for a little bit of review later this afternoon is the second one there, that children are safely maintained in their homes whenever possible and appropriate. And that really prioritizes family preservation, keeping the family unit intact. And what we'll see is that from the CFSR, and some of these measures we'll look at, some of the tension that was presumably unintended that comes when we try to achieve and pass the CFSR, and likewise preserve families in the home. So permanency here and well-being, again, these are our three priorities, and this is some guidance that's in the federal legislation on what those three terms mean.
I think that, Christopher, we can't underscore this point enough. What safety means, according to the CFSR, may not be what the community of child welfare, particularly law enforcement and other in the community, believe from a value perspective is safe for children. Should we be removing children sooner? Should we be removing children for things that may not rise to the standard of abuse and neglect? Given that poverty causes most of the neglect for which children enter into care, how do we differentiate risk of harm from actual safety? That's something else that the CFSR doesn't help leaders and community of practitioners to articulate, nor does it suggest a way to align values in the community. And so it almost creates a tension that the community itself must resolve, sometimes well and often not well, depending on the kind of relationships that exist on the ground.
On the permanency side too, there's a tension, and the CFSR fails to measure some things that we would consider permanency. If a child is able to stay safely in their home, that is not part of the CFSR currently, except in the file review portion. We'll get into more of the details of that. But permanency up until this point was thought of in terms of foster care, and we're trying to change that.
CFSR also established some timelines. Adoptions, for example, they wanted to be completed in 24 months. Well, what relationship did that have to the kind of capacity in the courts or the kinds of resources of adoptive families in the community? So supply and demand, given the level of expectations, were never really fully aligned. And so now you have a race to try to get it done with what you have. But the 95% compliance has no wavering. In other words, you don't get a handicap like you would in golf, given your service array or the state's resources. The standard remains high, rightly so when we're dealing with children, but it doesn't in any way say that you could have a runway as a state, at least not in setting the expectation.
So that's a little bit of the history. What we're going to look at now, and I'm really going to pass the buck to Isabel on this, is to talk about what an actual child and family service review feels like from a state experiencing it. We've had two here in Georgia. We failed both, but fear not, we're in good company. No one's ever passed a CFSR.
We don't use the pass-fail language.
Not in substantial conformity. I know this is being recorded. I got to watch this. But so I will pass it over to Isabel to talk about what that process looks like from both the statewide assessment standpoint and the on-site review.
I will begin to talk about the experience of the statewide assessment and the on-site review with this caveat. We government employees have a pass when we criticize each other. So I will be saying a few things about our federal partners, which they will forgive me for. The CFSR, as experienced by the state, is what we call the instrument of perfect torture. Unlike the guillotine, which is a clear stroke and you're done, the CFSR drags on and on and on. Think about like a dissertation that will take a very long time. The statewide assessment assumes that you yourself are capable of reflecting on your own 100 and some points in the assessment very well, and that you have the ability to write it in such a way that somebody else can comprehend it. And because it's written by many people, there's also the challenge of putting it in a language that is common to all the people who are writing it. So they want assessment that reflects local realities, and remember, Georgia has 159 of them, in one comprehensive state assessment for measures you have yet to really explore fully. And so the assessment takes over a year to write, and then they come back and reflect on that with you. The assessment is the study guide for the reviewers that come in. Now, after the assessment is written, after great pain and a lot of writers' challenge, they negotiate with you on which 3 counties they will draw cases for. The largest county in the state with foster care cases is a mandated county. So Fulton was a mandated county in Georgia. The 2 other counties were negotiable. And so given the kinds of characteristics we outlined by geographic areas in the statewide assessment, we were able to come up with 2 other counties. We picked a rural county and a county that was not near Georgia, a little larger county.
Not near Atlanta.
There we go, not near Atlanta. Not near Georgia, by an airport means too. The real criteria for the final choice, I know with the federal government, is how near the airport it is, and we know that for a fact. So the counties were decided on. Now the number of cases had to be decided on. The state scores would be based on the 2007 review on 65 randomly chosen cases in those 3 counties. So the entire state score, the entire perspective of the practice and the systemic indicators would be based on those 65 cases. They pick reviewers from other states that were trained on the CFSR guide. There is a Bible-like document which many questions which the reviewers have, and they will be looking at the cases. They come from out of state, and so the assessment really is their guide to be able to gauge what it is that they're looking at. They have to have access to our policy people and many others. So the state business, in a sense, stops for the number of weeks that those reviewers are in town in those different locations. They interview families, they interview children, they interview providers, they interview judges, they interview lawyers, they interview everybody at the state. So it's quite an extensive. And then there comes a day when there's the report out. And of course, what they told us in 2007 was that, again, we didn't pass a single indicator.
And so when we don't pass a single indicator, we negotiate and enter into what's known as a program improvement plan. And Isabel, I'll let you talk a little bit more about what a program improvement plan is, but we've been through 2 program improvement plans, and we've just recently, which was announced I think in the beginning during your bio, we've just recently completed our program improvement plan, or darn close to. The process
steps, certainly. Because we didn't pass a single indicator, and Christopher went over the 3 main buckets of work: safety, permanency, and well-being. Within those 3 main buckets of work, there's 7 main, I think, aggregates of those indicators. All in all, though, there are 23 indicators and 7 systemic factors. They give you a rating for each one of those 23 indicators and the 7 systemic factors. The 7 systemic factors are things like service array, training, case quality reviews, and things like that. And for every item that you did not pass at a 95, you have to put together a number of steps which you believe will get you into a better place. Now, you won't know what that better place is until they run your numbers and come up with a number of actual numeric targets that they want you to meet. So if you, let's say, had in item 4, which is risk and safety management, a 68.1, they might want you to get to 73. Now, that doesn't look like a huge improvement, does it? But I can tell you that takes a lot, because those are qualitative measures, meaning not only do we have to do the right thing, we have to document it in a way that when reviewed satisfies the reader that it is sufficient for that particular item. So there is a lot of objectivity and subjectivity that's applied to both. Now, I want you to remember, who's doing the documentation? Approximately 25 years old, not wanting to document all that much, and a new IT system, which is just terrific.
Yeah.
The first CFSR, when in 2001, we did not pass any, as you know, and the state negotiated 210 separate steps, and there were some numeric targets that we had to hit. We did not complete 7 of those steps to the federal government's satisfaction. That cost us $4.2 million in penalties. And that is state dollars. They don't want their own money back. So state dollars, $4.2 million in state dollars that are matched 2 to 1 in federal dollars. So it is a huge penalty, but wait, there's more. Until you successfully pass the next PIP. Meaning even if we had completed those 210 steps successfully, then that would have been great. But since we didn't, there's penalties that are accrued on a yearly basis. So for that $4.2 million, there was nearly $1 million worth of penalty that is assessed every year. So since the PIP, we have also been assessed. We haven't been able to pay because we have no money. Come and get it. We did pay one, but there's another $2 million still in outstanding penalties. For the 2007 PIP, we did a great job negotiating. There was only 100 steps, which had to be successfully completed, which we did, plus 9 numeric targets, which we have completed all 9 of them, and there's only one little thing they wanted Fulton to do. Now, you also know that the state is under a consent decree in Fulton and DeKalb. And so we had to negotiate with the federal government how that consent decree would be looked at in comparison with the CFSR. It puts the state at double jeopardy when you have Kenny A with substantial penalties, as well as the CFSR. So we had to find a way to convince the federal government that there were Kenny A indicators that were sufficiently like the CFSR indicators that they would take it as a proxy. We are the only state who successfully completed that negotiation.
And before I turn it over to Andy to talk a little bit about the data is used in the CFSR, I believe, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, and I think I heard the dean say it too, that we're in one of our 200 steps right now. Holding these legal trainings was part of the PIP for us to comply. So
is that right?
All part of helping us
well, that was a good
achieve,
thing.
Right?
Welcome to the PIP, yeah. Okay, so there are 2 data systems that are feeding this process, and up until the time of when we started doing the Child and Family Services review, there had been very little use of the data being sent up from these to the federal government from the state systems. And as a result of that, as you might expect, the data quality was extremely poor. So when the CFSR first came along, we had some pretty poor data. a reference point, Georgia back in 1999, I think, had about 35%, a third of the discharge dates missing from their children in foster care. So to the federal government, it looked like we were carrying 20 or 30,000 children in foster care, when in fact those children had been discharged years before. So that actually evened out within, I think, about 2 years of using the data, and now we're missing less than 1% of our discharge dates. And I now work with a lot of other states too, and I've seen exactly the same thing happen. As soon as you start using this stuff, the quality starts improving. Up until that time, everybody, many data people were fond of trashing these systems as not useful because of the poor data quality. In fact, what I found when I first started dealing with these data sets is that the quality really wasn't that bad, and was fairly easily improved by using the data. So there are two. The AFCARS, Adoption and Foster Care Reporting System, covers the foster care side of the house and adoption. We don't really use the adoption data sets in the CFSR, but we will in the future. The National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System, that would cover more of the child protection side of the house, before children come to foster care. The NCAN system really hadn't had very much use up until the CFSR. Now it is the reference system for safety numbers, and I use that quite a lot. We're always counting children, which is a nice switch. I've always had a lot of difficulty because we would talk in terms of cases, or we'd talk in terms of incidents, and we never actually knew how many children were involved. The federal government now requires us to count everything as a child record.
And so as we look at some of the CFSR measures, most of the measures are computed using this AFCARS data set. And it's really the children that have come into foster care, they've entered foster care, that foster care side of the business. One of the outcomes measures, the safety measure, is the NCAN's data set is used. And again, that's just one out of all of those measures, and it's covering once that child has been declared a victim of child abuse. And so as we move through and we start to talk about the CFSR and some of the issues and some of the progress we've made, I like to keep a little perspective on the population of victims of child abuse and neglect in our community at large. NIS is a federally mandated study that occurs about every 10 years. This is NIS 1 here. There's been 4 studies. NIS 4 came out earlier this year. NIS 1, the data was collected in 1980.
Tell them what NIS is.
National Incident Study. It's the National Incident Study.
This is Congress has required us to, has required the federal government to measure the actual true incidence of child abuse and neglect. Yes?
Does that information come from deprivation complaints or from police reports?
Neither.
And they do a completely separate study. So they actually, and so what they do is they do a separate study. So they actually work with the Child Protection Service Agency in the state, and then they go and they do a sentinel study with all of the other kind of stakeholders or the players in the game. And not even all, but you're using school caseworkers. And so it's not dependent on them referring the case to the CPS agency.
It's like they set up a parallel system to all of the systems we have in place that's much more intensive. So they have 500 or 600 sentinels in a representative sample of counties throughout the United States.
So the purple, could it also be termed not investigated and not reported, or both?
Well, and that's what we want to highlight here is that
We only know it wasn't investigated.
right, these are the rates here of child abuse over the 4 different studies. And you can see they've gone up, but what they expect is that for every 1,000 children in the nation, 17.1 are victims of child abuse and neglect. So for every 1,000, about 17 are victims of child abuse and neglect.
And this is a pretty well-designed study. It's a tremendously complex thing to do, tremendously complex study design. So I think that's actually a pretty good number. And it's gotten better and better over the years.
And as you see, the child abuse rates peak here at NIS 3, and then now it's returned to the NIS 2 level. As you see those fluctuate, what remains pretty constant is that our agency is only investigating about 1/3 of that amount. Which, again, the point being that we're really missing a lot of victims that are out there.
Most of them.
And if you think about it, think if this was the medical world, and think if we were in a system, in our cancer detection system, that we had invested billions of dollars in since 1980, was only catching a third of the actual problem.
This slide always generates a lot of robust discussion between us, because when I hear victim, then I want to hear in my mind that those are victims of something that rises to the level of abuse and neglect. In my mind, from a practitioner's perspective, all children are at some risk of experiencing an event, especially those in poverty, that may affect them adversely. But not everything rises to the standard of abuse and neglect. And when we begin to believe that what poor children need is to be investigated and then unsubstantiated and then getting nothing as a result, we are setting up a system that really doesn't help children. And so when we show this slide, I know last night, this morning, we were having some good, robust discussion about how to interpret this. It also sets us up for one thing, to ask ourselves, who's really responsible for the well-being of children? If the majority of those children are in the community, in schools, seeing a physician on a regular basis, going to church, in daycare, then why aren't these folks, in a sense, also contributing to the reduction of risk so they never actually have to come to the attention of the child welfare system? For me, it's very important to differentiate what is the role of child welfare. We are like the emergency room. When everything failed, as risk progressed into safety or lack of safety, that's where child welfare becomes involved. We are not responsible for the well-being of children everywhere. That is the role that is best left up to families and community. Government does not make a good parent. So I need to say those things to spur some good debate among us, because this is what we talk about. What are we as a community of practitioners in the child welfare system believe about safety? And should we be investigating everybody every day?
Or even every one of these victims, as the National Incident Study labels them. And it uses a very strict federal definition. And it's been a consistent definition over 30 years now. And they train up their sentinels and their investigators very highly to rate these cases.
And I think the...
Yeah, Kathy.
Let me...
But I didn't hear. You said the first year was 1980?
80 was the first year they collected data.
And did you go on to mention the years after that? I didn't hear that.
They were about 7 to 8 years apart. The most recent data collected for NIS4, I believe, was 2007. I think that's the data, maybe 2006.
I think it was 2006.
2006 data was used for the 4th National Incident Study.
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion around, it didn't capture the economic downturn and things like that, because we did see a decline for the first time in the rates.
And this is, is there another,
Kathy.
let me.
Can you talk a little bit about how the definition of incidents, and kind of, you said the study was very complex. So can you make that not so complex and give us just a little overview or a context of this very high number?
That's a challenge. Okay.
So one of the things that NIS distinguishes between, so you could be a victim of child abuse and neglect through the NIS definition, but not, I think I'm saying this backward now. NIS requires there to be an adult caretaker perpetrator. That's a requirement. Somebody that you're care and control of has been abused. You, as a caretaker, you abuse that child. We don't require that in Georgia.
Yeah, that's a
abuse
for
and neglect.
instance where they're following the federal definition strictly. So the perpetrator matters,
A homeless
whether or
child
not they're considered a victim.
But can we also then discuss that the definition of what is maltreatment, one is not standard throughout the nation.
That is not.
And in Georgia, it's particularly fuzzy. It's just about anything. It doesn't say that it has to be unintentional. It doesn't say that there has to be serious injury. And so if there is enough leeway to begin for us as people, as adults, as practitioners, to be able to put our values in it. So when we talk about what's in the best interest of the child, what it might have been in the best interest of my children to be raised by the 25-year-olds who put Facebook and who are now billionaires, because they would have had a whole lot more money than their mama could have given them, howsomever. Is that really in the best interest of my children? And so there's a whole lot to be discussed in these studies about what is the state's definition of maltreatment. When we say there's a perpetrator, what do we mean? And so
and that's where there's always misalignment with the states. So that's why we do a national study to try and get some kind of a consistent incidence level. There are a set of counties that are chosen to be representative of the entire United States. And there's a complicated sampling strategy to select those. They do try to get a lot of poor counties, a lot of urban. They try to sample all types of demographics that we'd have. And then the actual standards that are used to determine whether a child was a victim or not are split into a harm standard and an endangerment standard. And so the harm standard is that there was actual harm to the child by one of these selected perpetrators. And then the endangerment standard is that there's a risk of harm.
And I do think...
That purple
Go ahead.
So they
risk of harm as well as harm?
No,
on
this
that chart, that was
on
harm
this slide,
standard, right?
This slide was harm standard. And
Yeah.
there's actually going to be, I think...
The stricter standard, the higher bar.
And that's a coming soon. I think there will be a Child Welfare Legal Academy on the NIS study, which is well over 500 pages, and it's very confusing. And so we'll try and break that down for you at some point. It may be two of the three people up here. Let me at least draw your attention to this,
can't wait for that to happen.
which is really the point that I'm trying to make here, not to go into the NIS methodology, is there is a lot of abuse in our community that is known to the police, the juvenile probation, the public health, the schools, the hospitals. Schools is a big one. Daycare centers, that's not getting onto our agency's radar. Why is that?
That
That's
yellow
bad.
stuff, that's the stuff that the NIS knew about, but the agency didn't.
And so we're not reporting that to our agency. Maybe, and there's a lot of speculation now, and there's going to be subsequent reports on why that's happening. But the question is we somehow, as a community, need to incentivize finding these victims.
And you see how the conversation gets good, you know? This is right. Okay, let me make this one point. I do not believe that children are better off because they're reported to defects. Children are going to be better off when their communities and the adults within their community keep them from getting to the point that defects has to be involved. And so until we define our risk, yes, our risk tolerance and our risk elimination strategies. So what is DCH with Peach Care? What does all of the other programs, are they detecting risk or are they just passing out commodities? And so it has implications that I think are much more.
And even if you are detecting the risk properly, you balance that with the strengths too. So if you have a community that has a lot of strengths in it to support families, then these families may never rise to the level of an investigation or a report. And that's kind of the point. We do want to find out a true incidence rate and then study the systems that bring children from that. Yes?
What would you consider the situation that happened the other day when the mother... What would you consider the case that happened the other day where the mother dropped off the two kids and the little boy was running down the street and the daycare reported it? So where would that fall in line with what you all are talking about?
Mm-hmm. I'm not familiar with the case.
Well, the case was she pulled up to the daycare and the assistant went in and said that we had to check to see if they could accept the kids. The mother drove off. The little 2-year-old boy ran out to the park, and a neighbor came out and picked up the child from. She picked up the little boy from trying to get into the intersection of the street. The 4-year-old stayed there, and 4 hours later, the daycare called the police. 4 hours later, the parent did show up, and they arrested the mother for endangerment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, that's child endangerment. That's a different standard.
Well, but is it child endangerment? Obviously, it was not a good judgment.
Yeah.
It was obviously not a good judgment. But if then what we do is to criminalize that parent and put that child in foster care or in a family preservation, when something really serious happens, Where are we going to be? This is the question. If we route all clients to the emergency room, we won't be able to differentiate the difference
gotta
between how
move along
quickly
this.
I get to the heart attack as opposed to how quickly I get to the hangnail.
And I'm going to pass it on to Andy now to talk a little bit about our changing child welfare dynamics here in the state of Georgia.
Oh yeah. I did want to piggyback just before we move on to one thing that Isabel was talking about with the different standards across states too. The range looks something like you have Arizona where they substantiate 1% of their investigations, all the way up to Massachusetts where they find something like 5 times the national rate of victims. So we have a huge range of policies and actually probably of values across the United States. Now in Arizona, where they have hardly any victims as they label them, it's not that they're not bringing children into foster care. Most of the children that they bring into foster care, they would judge not to be victims of abuse and neglect, believe it or not. Tough to reconcile in a courtroom, I would think.
Ooh. Just to look at those same types of comparisons in Georgia, in 2004, when we changed the policy because of a horrific case, that anybody with a child under 4 was going to be investigated if they came to our attention. It didn't matter if there was 2 little boys on Sunday peeing off the porch. We were going to be there and we were going to investigate. And likely we were going to bring them into care. Now, what happened? We were investigating a tremendous amount of cases and unsubstantiating about 60% of those cases. So where was the resources being spent? And if it was unsubstantiated, there was little follow-up that was provided. So with all that barrage of cases, and more than half of them being nothing rising to the standard of abuse and neglect, and that's the important differentiating point, what happens? We are prevented from getting quickly to the cases who do. You'll see today we've turned that around. We are substantiating almost 60% and unsubstantiating 40%.
That's right. Yeah, so that reflects a better screening and assessment procedures, I think. So we just want to give you some idea of, from this 100% of victims that would have been found by the National Incidence Study out there. How would that filter down through our complex child welfare system and into a court case? So to connect it back to the court. So about, as I said, from the National Incidence Study, about, and this would be in terms of Georgia's number, I can estimate that about 62% of the true victims that would be found by the National Incidence Study would be reported to our defects. Moving down. Then about 50% of those would be investigated. And again, this is victims as found by the National Incidence Study. Now, about 12% of them would be undetermined. They would be they would not be investigated. When they're not investigated, we don't know whether there was a victim or not. Of the victims found by the NIS, about 12% probably, I'm guessing, judging from they break things down in the NIS in such a way that I can estimate for Georgia what that would be. Now, it's not to say that these undetermined did not have an intervention. There would be a response. They may have been reported. They weren't investigated. That's all we're saying.
And there are reasons for that.
And there are good reasons for that.
So I don't,
as we're
and sometimes
talking about.
we, the practitioners make errors. So when you look at that, you could perhaps be thinking 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
Did we make a mistake? Or did we not find enough evidence to investigate?
Investigated by defect?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
That's what he has up there.
Investigated by
Investigated by the
defect.
agency.
I guess the undetermined's throwing me off. Does that mean it's screened out?
It could have been.
So the question was a question about what it means to be undetermined.
We didn't investigate.
So basically,
It's a category 2 broad for us.
maybe. So we got a phone call. We being the agency, I get to be the agency now. We got a phone call, and from that, we heard the set of facts, and we either investigated or we didn't. And so this represents.
Of course, in reality, it's never that simple.
Right.
You get a call, you hear the allegation, You could begin by saying, I don't have enough facts in order to begin an investigation. The time frame for a timely response is the same on an alternative response as it is for an investigation. If you go out there, take a look from an alternative response perspective and you decide, oh, no, this really does look serious, we can flip it into an investigation. So this alone doesn't really, from a practitioner's perspective, go through the process of eliminating one response to another.
Right, and just to keep the big picture in mind, the demonstration here is solely to show what our system misses. So what our reporting system, our structure for capturing child abuse and neglect is missing. So again, it's easy to get kind of bogged down in the details, but we've got work to do.
Well, yeah, I think
especially right here with the not reported to defects.
I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as missing them either. Yeah.
Right.
So
thank you for helping me out because I'm about to bore these people with the same point.
I'm with Isabel on this.
I know. Okay.
This is our child welfare system addressing this group of victims, as found by the National Incident Study. There are good reasons all the way along here for diverting to a different path, or there can be. And some of those may be actual misses. Yeah.
It does seem to point out something that I think we could all agree with, that there are more children at risk, that perhaps we don't have a strategic approach to eliminate or reduce maltreatment eventually. If risk continues, it will turn into maltreatment unless the parental capacities to protect are increased. But let us not mistake that the real goal here is to have parents have sufficient capacity to protect their children so that they could be safe and to thrive with their families. Not that government should snatch them and then pretend that we are better than families.
Okay. So this is to get you a big picture view. Filtering down all the way through an investigation, coming down to the bottom here where we remove the victim to foster care, it's about 9% of that 100% of victims that are out there in the state. So as you see, our system could be overwhelmed if we brought more children down through this track. And a lot of other systems are, and ours was back in 2004, perhaps. You know, most of the children that we were investigating were not in fact victims by our investigation. So you can overwhelm the system with a whole other group of children that aren't in the National Incident Study who are actually not victims but look like victims to the reporters.
And finally, the other point here before we jump to the next slide is this is the bulk. They have to pass through this gate for the bulk to be considered for the Child and Family Services Review. The measures that the Child and Family Services Review has, by and large, focus on this
that
small
9%.
Portion
and
of our
overall.
overall.
And your court cases are that 9%.
Right.
Too.
These are the children that step into the courtroom, removed to foster care, by and large, and this is where most of the Child and Family Services Review measures are designed. So they take a snapshot of this to assess our bigger response.
So this is breaking it down a little bit in a different way, but this is going from actual defects reports and the disposition of the reports. So this is showing the change over time from 2004, where this big, huge green piece, those are the non-victims, the unsubstantiated investigations that we were doing. And we were doing a huge number of them. We were also doing a huge number on children who were victims. Now, by our standard. Now this red dashed line across here, this would be what the National Incident Study would say was our true rate of victimization. As you can see, in 2004, we were actually above that in terms of the children that we were moving through the child welfare system. So we were finding more victims than the NIS would. Now we're down over here, and we're investigating this portion of children in 2009. Relative to the national rate up here. So this is what gets investigated, would be all the way from the green, yellow, and the red. The red would be the children who are removed to foster care, and it's of the children who are reported now, so it's not that 100% from the NIS, but the children who are reported, about 5.5% actually end up coming into foster care, the victims. And then another 22% are go to family preservation services. These would be found victims who were not removed to foster care. And then the green would be the investigated non-victims. We want to try and minimize that because investigations are an invasive process that we don't want to inflict on a family if we don't have to. And then the light blue are the undetermined, which up until a couple of years ago we termed diversion cases. And the screen outs, finally, the blue, 24%.
So to reiterate, if I have this correct, what you can see is at that peak in 2004, over half of our reports, we investigated that. We subjected that family to an investigation, or this child's family,
Yes.
only to find that they were not a victim.
That's right.
And now we're, okay.
So I bring this up as way of explanation for a subsequent slide where you're going to see that our safety, and this is a very non-intuitive thing. Maybe we should move to the next one. Yeah.
But I think it would be
Oh, I'm
important
sorry.
to note that, could you flip back to that, please? Thank you. In 2001, when they came, we didn't pass any indicator. But when they came in 2007, every indicator almost had dropped further. Why? Because when you see the spike in 2004, we clogged up our cases so much with kids who need not have entered into care that we didn't have time to do the right work with the kids who really needed it. And so we had a revolving door. We'd take them in and maybe they'd exit quickly, but it attracted the attention, that running door, and we didn't do good work. As a result, the 2007 CFSR showed decline from indicators in 2001.
Right. This peak up here is 155,000 children reported into defects. Down here, we're at 75,000 children. So I'm bringing that up as context for this. I want to direct your attention first to this black line. These would be the children who came to the system, were found to be victims, substantiated cases of maltreatment, and then in another 6 months' time were again found to be victims. So they were re-abused. So these would be children that we failed to protect from re-abuse. So the total number of children re-abused in 2004 was 4,402 within 6 months. Today, we're at about 587, and we're lower than that today. It keeps coming down. So that's this black line, which peaked here in early 2004, first quarter of 2004. In the first quarter of 2004, there was a policy change that was implemented by the DHR board that said that we had to investigate every report from a mandated reporter. That's what this corresponds to, that big peak. It resulted in a huge increase in our investigations, which thus the 2004 peak in the other slide. It also resulted in a huge peak in our re-abuse rate. And that it's kind of counterintuitive if you believe that investigation is somehow protective. If on the other hand, you might think of investigation as actually disrupting a family and perhaps taking away some of their strengths, or in some way, or taking case managers' attention away to children who were non-victims or families that were not abusing their children, then you can see how this could happen. That we were missing cases. The system was completely overwhelmed, and we were not doing a good job of filtering out, of triaging what the important cases were to work on.
In 2004, there were over 3,000 investigations that were overdue. Today, there are 6.
So back here, back in 2000, when Terrell Peterson made the cover of Time magazine, and we had all of the attention on the child welfare system, we got new resources pouring into the child welfare system, $110 million a year, new money coming in. We nearly doubled our casework staff. And what did we do? This red, it's supposed to be red, brownish line, is our removal rate to foster care. Up, 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 up. We removed a lot more children into foster care. And this blue line are our discharges from foster care. They're falling behind the removal rates, and this solid blue line up here is our in care, the number of children we had in care on any given day. So that continues to go up, up, up until 2004, when we have a switch, when removals and discharges kind of equalize, and we get a little level, and then our discharges get above our removals. in this area, and we start bringing it down, down, down to this portion in which we had removals well below discharges for an extended period of time, and now they're coming together. So perhaps we're coming to some kind of a steady state where we have 7,500 children in care. Back up here, we had almost 15,000 children in care. Yeah, Terrence.
Andy, I'm wondering if some of the initiatives that I remember when that happened with Terrell Peters, and a lot of initiatives got poured into the state. One was the CPPC, the Communities Partnering for the Protection of Children, and Family Team Conferencing. A lot got poured, and a lot of initiatives were poured into the state as well. Is the reduction also, does it have anything to do with some of those initiatives actually helping out with the reduction, or?
Can't really tell you. I mean, the studies weren't done to know actually whether they're connected. We certainly, our standard for a victim, which is all we have to go by right now, our standard for a victim within defects changed over that time. And so it's very difficult to tell. We're seeing a lot fewer victims coming through the investigation stage at defects. There may be a good number of victims who are going through through an alternative response too. And we don't know. Those are that big undetermined chunk that we have there. So if, for instance, something like CPPC is actually working, we may have victims out there that whose needs are met by a different system, a different provider perhaps.
It might be important to note, and Andy's done some validation of our alternative response, about 5% of our cases that receive an alternative response actually come back and are substantiated for maltreatment, which is a very small percentage. And you had said, how does that line up with other national?
Yeah, other states they'll come back. The unsubstantiated cases as well as the alternative response usually come back at a rate of about 6 or 7%. And this reflects, I don't know whether it's intentional or not, but this reflects some kind of a community judgment on the balance between this number. So these are children who actually come through the full system of investigation and are protected very well. We're down to 2.5% re-abused within 6 months. And so it's a balance between the invasive interventions that we have and safety. And different states are coming down in different places. Do we want those all to be equal? I don't know. You know, you're going to have to investigate a lot more cases in order to do that. You're going to have a lot more intervention.
The national standard for re-abuse or repeat maltreatment in care is about, what is it?
It's 5.1%.
5.1. Yeah. So we're about half what the national standard is.
So as of now, Georgia ranks, I have this on another slide. Well, I thought I had it. Here we go. In the rate of recurrence of maltreatment within 6 months, Georgia is the 5th lowest in the country. The rate of removal to foster care, it's the 8th lowest. And the rate of children in care, in foster care per capita in the U.S., we're #1 lowest in the country.
But no applause.
Yeah. I mean, some of us think that's a good
That's
thing.
awesome.
Okay, Christopher.
Am
I going on? Okay.
Sure. Or we can. Well, what we wanted to do now is, in the last few minutes here before we take a break, is look at the different measures that the CFSR has. There's one safety outcome measure, and it's just that they compute a couple of different statistics to analyze this measure, but the idea is that keeping children safe from abuse and neglect. One of the benefits to this whole process, the CFSR, is what we put up here. So we put the Paulding County re-abuse rate, that 6-month re-abuse rate. And again, through this process of the federal government initiating the CFSR, improving that data quality, here in Georgia, we can actually go on to a public domain, and if you're a stakeholder, you can look up your county, you can look up your judicial circuit if you're a judge representing that circuit, and get this kind of detailed information about how well your community is serving these children and families that come into contact with the
Yeah, we should have put the website URL up on there. Sorry,
Yeah,
it's
somewhere
Fostering
in
Court
there.
Improvement. Fostering Court Improvement.
It is on one of
.org.
the slides.
Yeah, it's on another slide. I'll point it out when we get to that.
Okay.
But Paulding County, back in 2002, early 2003, peaked out at 23% of their children re-abused within 6 months. That, you know, in pretty much any kind of terms, is not a well-performing system. That was brought to their attention because we started getting some of the numbers, and we presume that somebody stepped up their game, and we're now down to near zero in Paulding County. Safety's dramatically improved.
There's also 4 permanency composites that they compute, and again, these are all driven by that AFCAR's foster care population data, and I'll let Andy talk a little bit about each of these.
Yeah, so I don't think the federal government put together in the first round of the CFSR. There were simple measures that most people could understand, just rates of things. The federal government decided that they didn't want anybody to actually understand these. So they turned them into composites, and they used principal components analysis to look at the variability and assign weights to all the individual measures. So there are actually 17 or 19, I forget, individual measures that go into a group of composites. But all you need to know about that is think about something like speed of reunification. In the first round, we just looked at how quickly children were reunified with their parents, or, with their relatives too. It's any kind of family in the federal terms. We always want to balance that with the reentry rates that we have, because states like Georgia, that in middle of 2004, we were reunifying most of our children within 3 weeks. That wasn't much of an intervention, and as it turned out, that those children did come back into foster care at a very high rate. We were running around 14% coming back then. Today, we have about 4% coming back into foster care, but we take 7.5 months to do a reunification. So you want to have a balance between those two things. So you want speedy reunification that's safe, and the composite tries to weave that together. So 4 composites: first on timeliness and permanency of reunification, second on timeliness of adoptions. Now, it's important to note too that with adoptions, there are now different routes to actually perform well on this measure. We don't just have to do speedy adoptions. If you, for instance, are if a state is very quick in getting from a termination of parental rights to a finalized adoption, that can get you into substantial conformity on this measure all by itself. You can take a very long time to come to a TPR, and so the 1522 rule is not pushing things as hard as it was. In Permanency Composite 3, the feds got a lot of feedback about children languishing in foster care, and they put in place some really decent measures for rating the system as in terms of how they handle children who are in foster care for a long period of time. This is the one that has driven our cold case project, which you probably heard about. I think there was another session on that. So for the cold case project, I'm going to actually refer to this composite to talk about it. And then lastly, placement stability is all by itself as the one well-being measure that we have.
And what we're gonna walk through a couple of slides now, and essentially we're trying to get you to conceptualize. Now you're experts on the CFSR. You've got it cold. We want you to think about in your own capacity, whether you're an attorney, whether you're join Andy in the ranks of being a statistician, or
Please.
In any of these other capacities, what you envision the CFSR to be, because we're going to walk through a couple of different perspectives from our angle about what we envision the CFSR to be. So this is kind of the first one we look at here, and I'll let Andy talk about it
Yeah,
briefly.
so this is kind of my cut at what our state's performance is looked at in terms of the CFSR permanency composites, as they're called. So this is just one piece of the larger whole of the CFSR. But over time, the national standards are straight across here, and I know you can't see them. So, but I'm going to point out some of them. But what I'm looking at here is how states change their practice. So I wanted a tool by which I could look at different states and figure out and look for the ones, for instance, with these kind of charts, I found Tennessee had a dramatic improvement in composite 3, which is the blue line. And we were looking at this time, this would be back here, Georgia was looking to improve on that because we needed to do it for our PIP. And I looked at Tennessee and they were down, I don't have the slide here, but they were down here at a 60, and then all of a sudden they came up here, just like that, overnight. And so I talked to some folks in Tennessee and they credited it largely to their privatization efforts, which was very odd to me. So I dug into it a little bit more and found out all kinds of new practices that they're trying in Tennessee, which I don't think they even realized were having such a dramatic effect in terms of these measures.
And the one thing that I want to draw attention to is this is another way to look at a CFSR score. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of take the Fed's perspective of what the CFSR is. So again, we talked about the individual components that make up an overall score. So I think we're looking at, and none of this really matters too much, I just want you to see the 4 different boxes. This is the reunification CFSR. And so we look at DeKalb County's performance here in a particular time period. We compare it to Fulton, we compare it to Cobb, we look at Georgia statewide, and we look at national performance. So if we just looked at DeKalb, so I want you to think back to the last math class you took. I think it was admitted in my profile that I was a former math professor, so I'm going to draw on that here for a little bit. And there was always one question I got right before the final exam. Students wanted to know one thing.
Grade on a curve.
Grade on a curve. I got that way earlier than the last day.
How to get extra credit.
Extra credit was pretty common, still not the most.
What was on the test?
That was also really common. There's still one more. What do I need? I didn't take it personally. They wanted to know what they needed to never have to see me again. What do I need to pass? And just like in those courses, there wasn't just the final exam, right? They had done some stuff along the way. So we had our quizzes, and that counted for some portion of your overall grade, your homework, maybe some projects, some extra credit. Each of those were computing and going towards the overall score. And so from the federal government's perspective, here's your blue dotted line. That was my answer to those students' question. You need to add your 4 components up, and they all have different weights, and they need to get you above this blue line, or we're going to come back and talk to you about a PIP. Or you can come spend another semester with me in the metaphor analogy. But this is really the way to envision it. They're taking each of these 4 different measures and pushing them together, and we're trying to surpass this national standard. So that's sort of the Fed's view of the CFSR: pass, fail.
And connecting back to what I said before, so there are a couple of ways to do it. The big blue bar here, this is on the national weighting that shows you this big blue bar, that's the reentry rate. So the bigger that is, the better you are, the lower you are in your reentries. So you can pass almost purely on the strength of your reentries. If you have low reentries, but you don't actually have speedy reunification, you still can be in substantial conformity. And that's a critical change.
And what Isabel shared with me last night is the agency's view of the CFSR, which we have here. And
Spaghetti soup.
And we've got just a few minutes here, but I will let Isabel talk a little bit about this because it's important for the context here. Again, there's a lot of time we do think that our practice is driven by the numbers, and I think this wholly demonstrates that it's not, that there's something else going on here. And I would never try to create this, but Isabel did, so I'll let her chat about it a little bit.
If you would know how to lead practice from those charts, you're a better woman than I am. I can't lead practice from 60 of these and 40 of those. First of all, social workers don't care that 2 and 2 is 4. They just want to know how 4 feels on the other side of the equation all by itself. Let's be clear. You start talking to social workers about numbers, and they glaze over and they become disengaged around the value that called them to the work. You also get into some very dangerous ground, which is to communicate to those people who don't understand the why behind the practice. They think you want them to give you numbers, and numbers will get children hurt. So the CFSR has 2 challenges for practitioners. One, to do it well, and the other one is to score well. We have to do both. We have to do good practice. Is that good English? We have to practice well, and we have to get good scores because there's a lot at stake. Remember, $4.2 million in 2001. Had we not been successful in 2007, or just now finishing our PIP, it would have been 8.6 plus interest compounded monthly until we passed the next one. And that is, remember, one state dollar to 2 federal dollars. Those are big dollars. So we have to practice well, and the federal government has what it takes to take what we got eventually. So we have to practice well, and we have to demonstrate it. So the way that I speak with my staff about this is that the CFSR, and really good social work practice. Now, we had to learn the CFSR, but now we don't speak so much CFSR. It's been integrated into our knowledge. It's in the back of the head, but that's not how we practice. There are 3 things that drive our practice today. Family engagement, and we've identified the items that have to do with family engagement. Item 17 with 2 wings, 14 and 12. And since you know CFSR, I won't read what they are. Item 19, worker visits with child, worker visits with parents. Item 20. Prior to the CFSR, we were not visiting every child every month or every parent every month. Today, we visit every child every month, upwards of 96% in the state. And every parent every month, whether in family preservation or in foster care, in order to determine whether those parents' capacity are increasing and whether the child's vulnerability is decreasing. When that happens, we have the good possibility for going home. Where it doesn't happen, then we have to move on. The child and family's involvement in the case is essential. So we call this our core practice steps. Now, the 2 other issues in item 4, which is risk and safety management, is key there. On the other side is safety management and permanency. We're linking 2 things as a value. First is ensure that the child is not in immediate or imminent danger at the point of investigation, but also ensure that a child has an adult or a family who's going to commit to them no matter what, or they won't be safe and then thrive. We know what happens to kids who age out in foster care, homelessness, and a number of other things I won't get into. But look, the 1 safety measure, timeliness, and then you have permanency measures on the bottom. On risk assessment, which is really our business, if we do a good job with safety at the front door, then permanency as the other variation of safety kicks in. But really, while they're in care or in family preservation, we are managing risk. How we're assessing risk, according to these indicators, is what my staff is looking at. And so we look at 3 things: family engagement, safety management, and permanency and risk assessment. And we are trying not to differentiate between safety and permanency. Those things are one. Ma'am.
Does the one child, well, every child once a month,
Every child every month? Mm-hmm.
every child every month rule, does that include FTM or outside of a family team meeting?
Outside of a family team meeting. That's a visit in the child's place of care, and there are things that we're supposed to be doing when we're visiting. The purposeful visit definition is one which we get into the quality of the visit.
Does that have to be the same caseworker?
The visits?
The assigned caseworker, do they have to do the visit every single month? Or could it be
No, if the provider is contracted to do that, they would send us the documentation, but every child has to be seen by a caseworker.
Not necessarily just a representative of the department.
Well, usually it's your caseworker, but it could also be the provider caseworker. We don't switch. Like if I'm the child's caseworker, we usually don't switch.
But let's say the kid's in LaGrange, and, you know, Susie caseworker, who's the assigned caseworker, can't go down there, so maybe Mary can't. Can Mary see that kid? It'll count?
Yes, it'll count. However, you should know that we are doing a great job at placing kids within 50 miles of their original community. And so that caseworker is still expected to go see that child. The county.
And what you're saying, though, is also children that are in a placement may be seen as a contractor of the department
Yes.
by the provider.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the providers have access through a portal into Shines to provide the documentation just like a caseworker would. In a sense, it's a privatizing move.
And so we're gonna go to a break here, but before we go, where are my attorneys in the room? Have my attorneys? This is what I think your view of the CFSR is. If I were to draw the attorney's view of the CFSR, that would be it. Anybody know who that is right off the bat? That's good. Who was that? Nice. So think about why Justice Brandeis, of the Justice on the Supreme Court, would be the lawyer's view, in my opinion. This is the lawyer in me kicking in, which happens rare. It's very rare. But why I think that Justice Brandeis is your view of the CFSR. We'll take about a 10-minute break and we'll get started again. So